How does a motorcycle club rise to a point where even the Hells Angels, an organization that has dominated outlaw biker culture for decades, approach it with caution? The Mongols MC did not arrive there through mythology or sudden notoriety. Their reputation grew through years of confrontation, survival, and an unusual refusal to disappear when pressure intensified. Violent clashes, federal prosecutions, and territorial expansion all played a role. What emerged from that history was something more unsettling, a rival that could not be easily pushed aside. A club born from rejection, the Mongols Motorcycle Club did not begin as a dominant force. In fact, its origin sits on the opposite end of power. The club was formed in Montebello, California, by Latino riders who had been rejected by established outlaw clubs. At the time, the biker world already had its hierarchy. Groups like the Hells Angels controlled large parts of the culture and the territory that came with it. The Mongols entered that environment as outsiders. Being excluded shaped the club's identity from the beginning. Many outlaw clubs form around rebellion, but the Mongols formed around something more personal: rejection from the very world they wanted to be part of. That difference mattered. Instead of inheriting status, they had to carve space for themselves inside a culture that already had powerful gatekeepers. In the early years, the Mongols were small and relatively unknown outside Southern California. But even during that period, the club began building a reputation that relied less on symbolism and more on presence. Members showed up consistently. They defended their patch aggressively, and they made it clear that being denied entry into the existing power structure would not mean staying outside of it. What slowly began to change was perception. In outlaw motorcycle culture, reputation spreads through observation. Clubs watch each other carefully, how they react to pressure, how they respond to confrontation, and whether they hold together when things become difficult. The Mongols started to develop a reputation for refusing to step back. This persistence began attracting riders who wanted to join something rising rather than something already established. Growth followed, but it was not explosive. The club expanded gradually through California and neighboring states, building chapters while trying to maintain internal discipline. What made the Mongols different from many smaller clubs was that they were not satisfied with simply existing under the shadow of more powerful organizations. Their goal was to be taken seriously inside the one-percenter world. That ambition eventually brought them into the same spaces, physically and symbolically, as clubs that had long controlled those spaces. And once two organizations with strong reputations occupy the same ground, tension stops being hypothetical. It becomes inevitable. Inside outlaw motorcycle culture, reputation does not come from history alone. It forms when a club enters spaces where it is not expected to survive. During the late 1970s and 1980s, the Mongols MC slowly began appearing in territories where older clubs already held influence. This was not done loudly. There were no public announcements or symbolic declarations. Instead, the club simply started showing up. Bars connected to biker culture, regional motorcycle events, and open highways became the first testing grounds. The Mongols rode in groups, often large enough to be noticed, but not large enough to provoke immediate confrontation. Their presence alone sent a quiet signal. They intended to exist in places where they had not previously been welcome. This kind of movement forces a reaction. Rival clubs begin to watch closely. Every appearance becomes a test. Would the Mongols withdraw if challenged? Would they avoid certain territories, or would they remain in place? Over time, something became clear. The Mongols did not disappear after pressure. When tension surfaced, they returned again later, sometimes with larger numbers. This repeated presence began altering how other clubs interpreted them. A group that refuses to leave eventually becomes part of the landscape. By the late 1980s, the Mongols had begun building chapters beyond their California roots. The expansion was cautious but deliberate. Each new chapter strengthened the club's sense of permanence. Riders looking for a rising organization saw an opportunity to be part of something gaining momentum rather than joining a club whose hierarchy was already fully established. What outsiders often misunderstand about outlaw motorcycle the clubs is that the real power structure is not defined by a single event. It forms gradually through repeated demonstrations of resilience. The Mongols were proving something With every year, they remained active in contested spaces. Law enforcement agencies began noticing the shift as well. Reports throughout the 1990s started classifying the Mongols as more than just a regional group. Investigators began connecting members to organized criminal activity, including weapons violations and narcotics distribution. These allegations increased federal attention, but they also reinforced the club's reputation inside the biker world. Pressure from both rivals and authorities can fracture smaller clubs. In the Mongols' case, the opposite happened. Each challenge seemed to harden the organization rather than weaken it, and, as their reputation grew, something else followed quietly behind it. Expectations. As the Mongols' MC continued to grow through the 1990s, their path increasingly began to intersect with the most established and powerful club in the outlaw biker world, the Hells Angels. This intersection was not announced publicly, and there was no single moment where the rivalry officially began. In outlaw motorcycle culture, these kinds of conflicts almost never start with declarations. They develop quietly through proximity, presence, and repeated encounters in the same spaces. By the time the Mongols were expanding beyond their early Southern California base, the Hells Angels had already spent decades building influence across the United States and internationally. Their reputation had been established through years of territorial control, disciplined organization, and a network that stretched far beyond a single region. In many parts of the biker world, their presence defined the power structure. Most smaller clubs understood this reality and adapted accordingly. Some aligned themselves as support clubs. Others deliberately avoided areas where Hells Angels chapters were already well established. The Mongols took a different path. Instead of positioning themselves under that existing structure, they began expanding into regions where the Hells Angels already had visibility. Nevada, Arizona, and parts of California slowly became shared spaces. The Mongols did not enter those areas with dramatic displays or public challenges. They simply began appearing more often at motorcycle rallies, in biker bars, and on long highway rides that connected different chapters. In biker culture, presence alone carries meaning. When members from two rival organizations start appearing at the same events and the same locations, tension builds, even when nothing immediately happens. Each meeting becomes an unspoken test. Who arrives first? Who arrives in larger numbers? Who maintains their position without leaving? These moments may seem small from the outside, but inside the outlaw motorcycle world, they are carefully observed. Every appearance communicates a message about confidence and control. Law enforcement agencies began noticing the shift during the mid-1990s. Intelligence reports frequently mentioned the rising proximity between Mongols chapters and Hells Angels chapters in several western states. Authorities often increased monitoring when large motorcycle gatherings included both clubs. The concern was simple: any confrontation between them could escalate quickly. What made the situation more complex was the Mongols' posture. They were not behaving like a club trying to avoid conflict with a larger organization. They were acting like a club that expected to operate in those territories permanently. That attitude slowly transformed occasional tension into a deeper rivalry. By the end of the decade, the Mongols and the Hells Angels were no longer just two clubs sharing the same roads. They had become two organizations whose influence was beginning to overlap, and in the outlaw biker world, overlapping influence rarely stays peaceful for long. When tension finally turned public. For years, the rivalry between the Mongols, MC, and the Hells Angels had existed mostly beneath the surface. Members of both clubs knew the tension was there, and law enforcement had been watching the growing friction for some time. But until the early 2000s, most of that hostility remained confined to smaller confrontations, quiet warnings, and moments of visible intimidation when both clubs happened to cross paths. Then, in April 2002, the situation moved out of the shadows. That moment arrived at the Laughlin River Run, a large motorcycle rally held every year in Laughlin, Nevada. Thousands of riders attended the event, and it had long been one of the biggest gatherings in the American biker calendar. Members from dozens of clubs typically showed up, including the Hells Angels and the Mongols. Events like these were always tense when rival organizations were present, but they were also heavily watched by law enforcement for that exact reason. On April 27, the tension that had been building for years erupted inside Harrah's casino. What followed happened quickly and violently. Surveillance footage later showed members of both clubs confronting each other in a crowded casino area. Within seconds, the confrontation escalated into a brutal fight involving knives, punches, and gunfire. When it was over, 3 men were dead and several others were seriously injured. The Laughlin incident immediately became national news. It was one of the most public and violent clashes between major outlaw motorcycle clubs in years. The fact that it happened in a crowded casino, surrounded by civilians and security cameras, made it impossible for the event to remain inside the closed world of biker culture. For the Mongols, the confrontation carried a complicated effect. On one hand, the violence brought intense law enforcement attention. Investigations expanded, arrests followed, and authorities began looking more aggressively at both clubs under racketeering laws. On the other hand, inside the 1%er biker world, the event sent a different message. The Mongols had not backed down from the Hells Angels in a direct confrontation. They had stood their ground against the most dominant club in the outlaw hierarchy. In a culture where reputation is built through demonstrations of resolve, that fact mattered. The aftermath also showed something else. Despite arrests and prosecutions tied to the incident, the Mongols did not disappear afterward. Their chapters continued operating. Members continued wearing the patch. The organization remained intact. For rival clubs watching closely, that survival carried weight. Laughlin did not end the rivalry between the Mongols and the Hells Angels, but it changed how the rivalry was perceived. From that moment forward, the Mongols were no longer viewed as a rising club testing the edges of the biker hierarchy. They were now seen as a rival, capable of confronting the very top of it and remaining standing afterward. Federal pressure that was meant to end the club. The violence in Laughlin did not only change how rival motorcycle clubs viewed the Mongols' MC, it also changed how federal authorities approached them. After the casino confrontation, law enforcement agencies across the United States began treating the Mongols as a far more serious organized crime concern than before. What followed was not a single investigation, but a series of coordinated federal efforts designed to weaken the club from the inside. By the mid-2000s, the Mongols had already drawn attention from agencies such as the ATF and the FBI. Investigators believed that some members were connected to organized criminal activities that extended beyond simple biker disputes. Allegations included weapons trafficking, narcotics distribution, and violent assaults linked to territorial conflicts. These accusations placed the club under the same kind of scrutiny that federal authorities had used for decades against major organized crime groups. The strategy used against the Mongols relied heavily on long-term infiltration. Undercover agents and informants were placed around members and sometimes inside the club's outer circles. Investigators spent years gathering information before launching large-scale indictments. The goal was not simply to arrest individuals, but to prove that the organization itself operated as a criminal enterprise under federal racketeering laws. In 2008, that strategy reached a turning point. Federal prosecutors announced sweeping charges against dozens of Mongols members in multiple states. The indictments accused members of participating in a wide range of crimes tied to the club's activities. Several high-ranking figures were arrested, and prosecutors made it clear that they were attempting to dismantle the organization's leadership structure. But the most unusual move came afterward. Federal authorities attempted something rarely seen in organized crime. Cases. Prosecutors sought legal ownership of the Mongols' trademarked patch and name. The patch was not just a logo worn on leather jackets. It represented the identity of the club itself, its history, its authority, and the symbol that connected chapters across different regions. By seizing the trademark, authorities hoped they could make it illegal for members to display the insignia. The theory behind this approach was simple. If the club could not legally wear its own patch, its identity would begin to collapse. Members might stop showing allegiance publicly. Recruitment would become harder. Chapters could slowly dissolve. However, the strategy did not unfold as smoothly as expected. Although many Mongols members were convicted or imprisoned during the prosecutions, the organization itself did not disappear. Legal challenges complicated the government's attempt to permanently seize the patch. Courts questioned whether such a move could realistically prevent members from continuing to identify with the club. While the legal battle continued, something important became visible. Despite leadership arrests, despite federal surveillance, and despite the threat of losing their symbol, the Mongols remained active. Chapters continued to operate. New members continued to appear. For rival clubs watching the situation unfold, the message was unmistakable. The Mongols were not a club that collapsed easily under pressure. A club that refused to collapse. Large criminal investigations often have a predictable outcome for outlaw organizations. Leadership arrests create confusion. Chapters begin losing coordination. Members distance themselves from the club to avoid prosecution. Over time, the structure weakens until the organization becomes a shadow of what it once was. Federal authorities have relied on that pattern for decades when targeting large groups. What made the Mongols' MC unusual was how little of that collapse actually happened. After the 2008 indictments and arrests, many observers expected the club to fracture. Several high-ranking members had been taken into custody. Informants had exposed parts of the organization's internal operations. The attempted seizure of the Mongols' trademarked patch had introduced a legal threat to the very identity of the club. On paper, it looked like the kind of pressure that had dismantled other outlaw groups in the past. Yet the Mongols did not disappear. Instead, the club adapted in ways that surprised both investigators and rival clubs. Leadership roles were filled by other members. Local chapters continued operating under the same structure. Communication became more cautious, but the network itself remained intact. This ability to regenerate after major arrests is one of the traits that defines long-lasting organizations. The Mongols had built a structure that did not rely entirely on a single leader or a small group of decision-makers. Authority existed at multiple levels. If one layer was removed, another remained. For members inside the club, the federal crackdown reinforced a sense of shared identity. The legal fight over the patch became symbolic. Wearing the insignia was no longer just about membership. It became a statement that the organization still existed despite attempts to erase it. Outside the club, other biker groups were watching carefully. In the outlaw motorcycle world, survival matters more than almost anything else. Clubs come and go, but those that survive intense pressure gain credibility. A group that can absorb arrests, federal investigations, and leadership losses without disappearing becomes something harder to challenge. The Mongols were beginning to show that kind of resilience. Even law enforcement reports acknowledged that the organization had not been dismantled by the indictments. While individual members were imprisoned, the club itself continued functioning. New chapters appeared. Existing ones remained active. For rival organizations, including the Hells Angels, this persistence carried weight. The Mongols were no longer just a rising club testing the boundaries of biker culture. They were becoming something more durable, an organization that had been attacked at multiple levels and had still managed to remain standing. In a world where reputation grows through survival, that kind of endurance changes how others approach you. And once a club proves it cannot be easily broken, every future confrontation begins to look very different. Territory was never just geography. In the outlaw motorcycle world, territory is not defined only by maps. It is defined by influence. The bars a club frequents, the motorcycle rallies its members attend, the highways, its riders travel in formation. These places form a kind of invisible boundary system that other clubs understand, even when nothing is written down. Maintaining those boundaries has always been central to biker culture. As the Mongols' MC grew stronger during the 2000s, their expansion began to test that system more directly. Originally concentrated in Southern California, the club had gradually moved into nearby states. Nevada, Arizona, and parts of the western United States began seeing Mongols chapters appear with increasing frequency. the expansion did not happen all at once. It followed a pattern the club had used since its early years: arrive quietly, establish a small presence, then allow that presence to grow. This slow movement forced rival clubs into a difficult position. When a new chapter appears in an area, established organizations have to decide how to respond. Ignoring the new presence may allow it to become permanent. Confronting it too aggressively risks escalating conflict that attracts law enforcement attention. Either choice carries consequences. For the Hells Angels, whose network had long dominated large parts of the biker landscape, the Mongols' expansion introduced an unfamiliar kind of pressure. The Mongols were not simply passing through these regions, they were planting roots. Evidence of this shift appeared in various ways. Motorcycle rallies that once saw only one major club begin showing members from both organizations. Biker bars in certain regions began hosting riders associated with each group. Even highway travel patterns changed as chapters coordinated longer rides between states. These developments did not always lead to immediate violence. Often the tension existed in the background. Riders from both clubs might arrive at the same event, aware of each other's presence but maintaining distance. The atmosphere could become tense without a single word being exchanged. Law enforcement agencies began taking notice of these patterns. Intelligence reports often flagged gatherings where both the Mongols and the Hells Angels were expected to appear. Authorities understood that territorial friction between the two organizations had the potential to escalate quickly if the wrong trigger appeared. But what made the situation more complicated was the Mongols' consistency. They did not treat these territories as temporary experiments. Once a chapter was established, it rarely disappeared. Members continued attending local events, maintaining relationships, and strengthening their presence over time. In biker culture, persistence carries meaning. A club that keeps returning to the same places eventually becomes part of the local environment. And when two powerful organizations begin sharing the same environment, the tension between them becomes something neither side can completely ignore. The quiet discipline inside the club outlaw motorcycle clubs often project an image of chaos, from the POWs, outside leather jackets, roaring engines, and a culture that appears built on rebellion. But organizations that survive for decades rarely operate on chaos alone. Behind the public image, many of these clubs rely on strict internal discipline. In the case of the Mongols MC, that discipline became one of the reasons the club managed to survive intense pressure. Membership in the Mongols was not automatic. Riders who wanted to join did not immediately become full members. Instead, they entered a period known as prospecting. During this stage, prospects spent months, sometimes years, proving their loyalty and reliability. They attended meetings, rode with the club, and followed instructions from full members without question. The prospect period served an important purpose. It filtered out individuals who might become liabilities. In a world where law enforcement investigations were constant and rival clubs were always watching, trust inside the organization was essential. The club needed members who would remain loyal even under pressure. Once accepted as full members, individuals entered a structured hierarchy. Like many motorcycle clubs, the Mongols organized chapters with defined roles. A president oversaw the chapter, a vice president assisted with leadership, and a sergeant-at-arms handled discipline and security. Each role carried responsibility, and the chain of authority helped prevent confusion during conflicts or investigations. This internal structure made the organization more stable than many outsiders expected. When arrests occurred or leaders were imprisoned, other members were already positioned to take over responsibilities. The club did not depend entirely on one figure at the top. Another important element of discipline involved communication. Members were expected to avoid discussing internal matters with outsiders, and even inside the club, information often moved along rank lines. This approach limited the amount of sensitive knowledge any one person possessed. Law enforcement investigations did manage to infiltrate the Mongols at times, but the club's compartmentalized structure often reduced the damage caused by informants. Even when some members cooperated with authorities, the broader network continued functioning. For rival organizations, this internal discipline mattered. In outlaw motorcycle culture, Many clubs collapse, not because of external enemies, but because of internal conflict. Leadership disputes, betrayal, and financial disagreements have broken apart groups that once appeared powerful. The Mongols showed a different pattern. Despite arrests, legal pressure, and territorial disputes, the organization rarely fractured publicly. Leadership changed when necessary, but the club itself continued operating. Over time, that consistency built something more valuable than raw numbers. It built credibility. And credibility, in a world where reputation defines survival, is one of the strongest forms of power a club can possess. Violence was never random. Violence has always existed within outlaw motorcycle culture, but not all violence carries the same meaning. Some conflicts erupt suddenly, driven by personal disputes or impulsive decisions. Those events tend to fade quickly. The confrontations that shape reputations are different. They are remembered because they reveal how a club responds when it is directly challenged. For the Mongols MC, violence was rarely constant, but when it appeared, it tended to be deliberate. Their confrontations with rival clubs, particularly the Hells Angels, were not simply street fights between individuals. They were moments that reflected deeper tensions tied to territory, influence, and reputation. After the Laughlin casino incident in 2002, both clubs became aware that any future encounter could escalate quickly. That awareness changed the atmosphere whenever members of the Mongols and the Hells Angels appeared in the same environment. Large biker rallies, regional motorcycle events, and certain bars became places where tension could rise without warning. Law enforcement reports from the following years often described situations where both clubs attended the same gatherings under heavy surveillance. Officers knew that even minor provocations could trigger larger confrontations. The history between the two organizations meant that neither side wanted to appear weak. What made the Mongols difficult for rivals to predict was their response pattern. They did not react to every provocation immediately. Sometimes tensions would simmer without visible retaliation. Other times, confrontations would appear suddenly, after long periods of relative calm. This unpredictability forced rival clubs to remain cautious. In outlaw culture, a predictable opponent can be managed. If a club always responds the same way to pressure, its rivals learn how to anticipate those reactions. The Mongols did not develop that kind of predictable pattern. Their responses varied depending on the situation, the location, and the stakes involved. This created a kind of psychological pressure within the biker world. Rivals could not easily assume how the Mongols would react to a challenge. Every confrontation carried the possibility of escalation. At the same time, the club's leadership understood the risks of uncontrolled violence. Large-scale conflicts attract law enforcement attention, and federal investigations can damage even the strongest organizations. Because of this, many confrontations between the Mongols and rival clubs remained contained rather than expanding into prolonged wars. But containment did not erase memory. Each incident added to the Mongols' reputation. Over time, the pattern became clear. When the club felt its status or territory was being threatened, it was willing to respond with force. For rival clubs, observing from the outside, the message was simple. The Mongols were not a group that could be pushed aside easily, and that understanding slowly began to shape how other organizations approached them. Federal surveillance changed the game. By the early 2000s, the Mongols MC were no longer just being watched by rival motorcycle clubs. They were being watched closely by federal authorities. The attention had grown steadily over the years, but after the Laughlin incident and the club's continued expansion, law enforcement agencies began treating the Mongols as a major organized crime concern rather than simply a biker group involved in occasional violence. Investigations expanded across several states. Federal agents began using long-term surveillance operations, wiretaps, undercover agents, and informants in an attempt to understand how the organization operated. The goal was not just to prosecute individual members, but to uncover how decisions were made inside the club and whether those decisions connected to organized criminal activity. For many motorcycle clubs, this kind of sustained federal attention becomes a breaking point. Members begin distancing themselves from leadership, Chapters lose communication with one another. Internal distrust spreads as the fear of informants grows. Eventually, the organization begins to weaken from inside. But the Mongols did not follow that pattern in the way investigators expected. Instead, the club began adjusting to the pressure. Meetings became more private, communication became more cautious. Members grew increasingly aware that law enforcement was attempting to infiltrate their circles. This awareness changed how the club operated, forcing it to become more careful without completely disappearing from the biker landscape. Rival clubs noticed these adjustments as well. An organization that learns how to survive under federal surveillance becomes a much more complicated opponent. When authorities begin targeting a club aggressively, other biker groups often assume that the pressure will eventually weaken it. In the Mongols' case, that weakening never fully arrived. Even during the height of federal investigations, Mongols chapters continued appearing at rallies, organizing rides, and maintaining their presence in regions where they had already established influence. The club had clearly been affected by arrests and prosecutions, but it had not collapsed. This resilience carried an important signal inside the outlaw biker world. Surviving law enforcement pressure requires discipline and patience. It means resisting the kinds of internal conflicts that often destroy organizations once federal investigations begin. The Mongols managed to maintain enough internal cohesion to avoid that kind of fragmentation. For the Hells Angels and other rival clubs, this survival added another layer to the Mongols' reputation. They were not simply a club willing to confront rivals. They were a club capable of continuing to operate even while under intense scrutiny from federal authorities. And when an organization proves it can function under that level of pressure, it becomes far harder for any one rival or government to predict how long it might endure. Growth that refused to slow down. One of the most unexpected developments in the history of the Mongols MC was that their expansion did not stop even while the club was under heavy legal pressure. For many organizations, federal indictments and constant surveillance tend to freeze growth. Recruitment becomes risky, new chapters hesitate to form, and the group focuses primarily on survival. The Mongols moved differently. During the late 2000s and early 2010s, the club continued establishing chapters beyond its traditional strongholds. Some appeared in new regions across the United States, while others began forming internationally. Countries in Europe and parts of Asia eventually saw Mongols chapters emerge, connecting the organization to a broader global biker network. Expansion at that scale changed how the club was viewed. A motorcycle club that exists only in one state or region can be pressured locally. Authorities can concentrate resources in that area. Rival clubs can isolate it geographically. But once a network spreads across multiple states and countries, containment becomes much more complicated. The Mongols' growth also meant that the organization was no longer dependent on a single territory. Chapters in different locations began forming their own local relationships with bars, biker communities, and motorcycle events. These connections helped anchor the club into the environments where it operated. For riders who wanted to join a powerful organization, the Mongols increasingly appeared as an attractive option. The club had a reputation for resilience and defiance, and its continuing expansion suggested that it was not going anywhere soon. This steady growth was noticed not only by law enforcement, but also by rival clubs. In the outlaw biker world, a club that expands while under pressure sends a clear message. It means that whatever forces are being applied against it, legal, territorial, or social, are not strong enough to stop its momentum. For the Hells Angels, who had long built their own influence through international expansion, the Mongols' growing footprint introduced a new factor into the power balance. The Mongols were no longer a regional challenger that could be contained in California or the western United States. They were becoming something larger, a club with reach that extended beyond the traditional boundaries of their early history. With every new chapter that appeared, the Mongols reinforced the idea that they were not simply surviving, they were continuing to grow. And in a world where reputation is tied closely to momentum, growth under pressure can be one of the most powerful signals an organization sends to its rivals. Reputation that spread faster than violence. By the time the Mongols' MC had expanded across multiple regions, something important had begun to change in the way the club was perceived. Their reputation was no longer tied only to specific incidents like Laughlin or to the federal investigations that followed. Instead, the Mongols had developed something that travels much farther than a single event, a reputation built through years of survival. In outlaw motorcycle culture, stories move quickly. Riders travel across states for rallies and gatherings. Clubs maintain connections with supporters, affiliates, and other biker groups. Information spreads through those networks long before it appears in newspapers or official reports. As the Mongols continued operating, despite legal pressure and territorial tension, the stories about them began circulating widely. Riders in different states heard about the club's confrontations with rivals, its conflicts with federal authorities, and its refusal to dissolve when pressure intensified. Reputation in this environment does not depend entirely on accuracy. What matters more is the pattern people believe they are seeing. In the case of the Mongols, the pattern appeared clear to many observers. They had confronted the Hells Angels directly and remained standing afterward. They had been targeted by federal investigations and continued operating. They had expanded into new territories instead of retreating from contested ones. These repeated developments created an image of durability that began to shape how other clubs viewed them. Even groups that had never encountered the Mongols directly started treating the club as a serious presence within the 1%er world. This kind of reputation has real effects. When a club carries a reputation for resilience and aggression, rival organizations tend to approach it with more caution. Encounters become more controlled. Gatherings where both groups might appear are watched more carefully. Small disputes are less likely to be allowed to spiral out of control. Law enforcement reports sometimes noted this atmosphere at major biker events. Authorities often increased security whenever both the Mongols and the Hells Angels were expected to attend. The concern was that the long history between the two clubs meant tensions could rise quickly, but just as often, nothing happened. That absence of conflict did not mean the rivalry had disappeared. It often meant both sides understood exactly what escalation could lead to. Over time, the Mongols' reputation reached a point where the club no longer needed constant confrontation to reinforce its status. The history itself did the work. In the outlaw biker world, a reputation built on survival can become more powerful than a reputation built only on violence. And once that reputation spreads far enough, it begins influencing behavior even in places where the club has never ridden before. A rival that could not be ignored. By the early 2010s, the Mongols' MC had reached a point where they could no longer be treated as a temporary disruption inside the outlaw biker world. Years earlier, some rival clubs had viewed them as a rising group that might eventually fade under pressure from larger organizations or from law enforcement. That expectation slowly disappeared. What changed was not a single confrontation or event. It was the accumulation of years in which the Mongols continued to operate, despite multiple forces working against them. First came the territorial tension with established clubs, particularly the Hells Angels. Then came violent clashes that attracted national attention. After that came federal racketeering cases designed to dismantle the organization. On top of all that, there was the unusual legal attempt to strip the club of its own identity by seizing the Mongols' trademarked patch. Many organizations would have fractured under a sequence like that. The Mongols did not. The club absorbed the pressure, adapted to it, and continued moving forward. Leadership roles shifted when necessary. Chapters remained active, new members continued appearing. Inside the 1%er world, that kind of persistence does not go unnoticed. Motorcycle clubs spend a great deal of time watching each other. They observe who grows, who disappears, and who survives when things become difficult. Over time, the Mongols began to occupy a different place in those observations. They were no longer the outsiders who had once been denied entry into the established biker hierarchy. They had become one of the organizations that helped define it. For the Hells Angels, this shift created a more complex relationship. The Mongols had proven they could not simply be pushed aside. At the same time, neither club had any interest in a prolonged war that would attract overwhelming federal attention. The result was a tense balance that existed in many places where both clubs had presence. Events where members of each organization might appear were approached carefully. Travel routes were considered more deliberately. Even the smallest confrontations carried the risk of igniting something larger. In that environment, reputation becomes a stabilizing force. The Mongols had built a reputation that made rivals think twice before escalating conflict, not because the club was unbeatable, but because the consequences of confrontation had become difficult to predict. That unpredictability is what eventually transforms a rival into something else. Not an enemy to be eliminated quickly, but a rival that must be calculated, measured, and respected, whether anyone says it out loud or not. The cost of escalation. By the time the Mongols MC had established themselves as a permanent presence in the outlaw biker world, one reality had become difficult for rival clubs to ignore. Any serious confrontation with them carried a cost that was no longer easy to control. The issue was not simply whether one club could defeat the other in a single clash. The problem was what might follow afterward. Large outlaw motorcycle clubs operate within a delicate balance. They rely on reputation and controlled displays of strength, but they also have to manage the constant risk of attracting law enforcement attention. Whenever major conflicts break out between powerful clubs, that attention intensifies immediately. Investigations expand, surveillance increases, and federal prosecutors begin building cases that can affect entire organizations. The history between the Mongols and the Hells Angels had already demonstrated this pattern. The Laughlin confrontation in 2002 had resulted not only in deaths, but also in a wave of investigations that brought federal agencies deeper into the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs. Later indictments and racketeering cases showed how quickly a violent clash could evolve into a legal campaign targeting dozens of members. Both organizations understood those consequences. For the Mongols, the experience reinforced their identity as a club capable of surviving intense scrutiny. They had faced arrests, infiltration attempts, and the threat of losing their own symbol, yet they continued operating. For the Hells Angels, the situation introduced a different kind of calculation. Dominant organizations protect their position not just through force, but through long-term stability. Prolonged wars can damage that stability by drawing massive legal pressure and disrupting established networks. As a result, encounters between the two clubs increasingly carried an element of restraint. This restraint did not mean trust or cooperation. The rivalry remained real, and tensions could still surface when members of both groups appeared in the same locations. But the potential cost of escalation was always present in the background. Law enforcement agencies were aware of this dynamic as well. Major biker events where both clubs might attend were often monitored carefully, precisely because authorities knew the history between them. The presence of surveillance and security sometimes helped keep confrontations from spiraling into open violence. Over time, the rivalry settled into something more complicated than constant conflict. Both clubs understood each other's capacity. Both knew that pushing too far could ignite consequences that neither side could fully control. In the outlaw motorcycle world, that kind of understanding can create a strange form of stability. Not peace, but a tense equilibrium where every move is weighed carefully, because everyone involved knows exactly how expensive a mistake could become. The balance that neither side wants to break. By the time the Mongols MC had spent decades building their reputation, the relationship between them and the Hells Angels had moved beyond simple rivalry. It had evolved into something more delicate, a balance that neither side seemed eager to destroy completely. Outlaw motorcycle clubs operate in an environment where reputation, territory, and stability all overlap. Violence can establish dominance, but prolonged conflict can also damage both sides involved. Large-scale wars between powerful clubs attract enormous law enforcement attention, disrupt alliances, and weaken the networks that clubs rely on to maintain influence. The Mongols and the Hells Angels both understood this reality. Each organization had experienced what happens when a confrontation grows too visible. The Laughlin casino incident had already demonstrated how quickly a single clash could trigger years of investigations and legal battles. Neither club benefited from the wave of attention that followed. As a result, the rivalry between the two groups gradually settled into a tense equilibrium. This equilibrium did not mean the hostility disappeared. The history between the clubs remained, and tensions could still surface when members crossed paths. But there was also a growing awareness on both sides that total escalation could bring consequences neither organization wanted. In areas where both clubs had presence, members often approached gatherings and events with caution. Travel arrangements were sometimes planned more carefully. Situations that might once have triggered immediate confrontation were handled with greater restraint. Observers within the biker world noticed this shift. It did not mean the Mongols had replaced the Hells Angels as the dominant club, nor did it mean the Hells Angels had lost their position. Instead, it reflected something more subtle. Both clubs recognized the other as a serious force. The Mongols had proven they were capable of surviving violent clashes, federal prosecution, and territorial pressure. The Hells Angels had decades of experience, a massive international structure, and deep influence within the biker world. When two organizations with that level of capability face each other, outright war becomes less attractive. The risks become too large, and the outcome too uncertain. What remains instead is a constant awareness of the other side's presence. The Mongols earned that awareness through years of persistence and survival. They did not disappear when pressure intensified. They did not retreat permanently from contested spaces. Over time, that persistence created something more powerful than temporary intimidation. It created a rival that even the most established club had to consider carefully. And, in the outlaw biker world, being taken seriously by the Hells Angels is one of the clearest signs that a club has reached the highest level of the hierarchy. The kind of fear that isn't spoken. In the outlaw motorcycle world, fear rarely looks the way outsiders expect. No club admits it publicly, members do not speak about it, and rival organizations rarely frame their actions around it. Strength, pride, and reputation are central to the culture. But fear still exists, just in a quieter form. It shows up in planning. When two powerful clubs know the history between them, every encounter becomes calculated. Riders think about who is traveling with them. Event organizers think about who might appear. Clubs consider whether a situation is worth pushing further or leaving alone. By the time the Mongols' MC had reached their current position in the biker world, the fear connected to them had become structural rather than emotional. The Mongols had demonstrated something important over the years. They could not be removed easily. They had faced violent confrontations and continued operating afterward. They had endured years of federal investigations that targeted their leadership and structure. They had survived an attempt to legally erase their identity by taking away their patch. Through each of these moments, the club adapted instead of collapsing. Inside outlaw motorcycle culture, that kind of endurance changes how rivals think. A club that disappears after a few arrests can be ignored. A club that fractures after internal disputes can be pushed aside. But a club that survives repeated attacks becomes something more complicated. It becomes a permanent variable. For the Hells Angels, that permanence matters. The organization has existed long enough to see many rival clubs appear and vanish. Some groups rose quickly, but eventually faded once pressure mounted. The Mongols did not follow that pattern. Instead, they stayed. Their chapters remained active. Their members continued riding. Their influence spread across new regions. This is where the fear behind the title truly exists. It is not the fear of losing a single fight. It is the fear of starting something that cannot be finished quickly. Prolonged conflict between two powerful clubs would attract enormous attention from authorities and destabilize the networks both organizations depend on. Every escalation would carry consequences far beyond the original confrontation. Because of that, encounters between the Mongols and the Hells Angels often carry a layer of careful calculation, not because either side is weak, but because both sides understand exactly how dangerous the other one can be. End quote. The truth behind the reputation. By the time the praises, Mongols MC had spent decades inside the outlaw motorcycle world, the reputation surrounding them had grown far beyond any single incident. Stories about their confrontations, their survival under federal pressure, and their rivalry with the Hells Angels circulated widely among riders and biker communities across different regions. But behind that reputation lies a more practical reality. The Mongols did not become feared simply because they were violent. Many outlaw clubs have histories of violence. What separated the Mongols was their ability to endure. From their earliest days, the club had to build its position from the outside. They were not welcomed into the established biker hierarchy when they formed. Instead, they created their own path through persistence. That mindset shaped how the organization reacted when pressure arrived later. The Laughlin casino confrontation in 2002 showed that the Mongols were willing to stand their ground in a direct clash with the Hells Angels. The years that followed proved something even more important. Despite the investigations, arrests, and legal campaigns that came afterward, the club did not disappear. Federal prosecutors attempted to dismantle the Mongols through racketeering cases. Authorities even tried to strip the club of its own identity by seizing the Mongols' patch. Yet chapters remained active, members continued riding, and the organization adapted to the pressure. Inside outlaw motorcycle culture, survival like that carries weight. Clubs measure each other not only by their strength in a fight, but by their ability to stay intact when circumstances turn against them. A group that collapses under pressure loses credibility quickly. A group that survives begins to command respect, even among rivals. For the Hells Angels, the Mongols eventually became one of those rivals. The two organizations still represent different histories within biker culture. The Hells Angels built a global empire over many decades. The Mongols built their position by pushing against that established structure and refusing to disappear. The result is not a simple story where one club defeats the other. Instead, it is a rivalry shaped by recognition. The Mongols proved they could withstand challenges that have destroyed other organizations. They showed that federal pressure, territorial conflict, and internal change would not automatically erase them. And once that kind of durability becomes clear, the reputation surrounding it begins to grow on its own. In the outlaw biker world, a club that refuses to disappear eventually becomes something every rival must consider, even the most powerful ones. Rivalries in the outlaw motorcycle world rarely follow a simple path. They are not clean competitions where one organization defeats another and claims permanent control. Instead, they reveal something deeper about how power actually works inside that culture. The long tension between the Mongols' MC and the Hells Angels is a clear example of that reality. For decades, the Hells Angels built their reputation as the dominant club within the 1%er biker world. Their network spread across continents, their chapters were tightly organized, and their name carried recognition almost everywhere motorcycle clubs existed. Many smaller clubs either aligned with them or avoided direct confrontation. The Mongols arrived in that environment as outsiders. They did not possess the same global reach or historical prestige when they began expanding. What they brought instead was persistence. The club grew slowly, established chapters in contested areas, and refused to retreat even when pressure intensified. Over time, this persistence began to reshape how the biker world interpreted the Mongols' place in the hierarchy. The club proved capable of confronting the Hells Angels in moments of direct tension. They survived federal investigations that attempted to dismantle their structure. They continued expanding even when authorities were watching closely. These developments forced rival clubs to reconsider old assumptions. Power inside outlaw motorcycle culture is not static. It shifts based on who survives, who expands, and who maintains internal discipline when things become difficult. The Mongols demonstrated enough of those qualities that they could no longer be treated as a temporary challenger for the Hells Angels. This did not mean losing their long-standing position at the top of the biker hierarchy. Their international presence and decades of influence remained significant. But the Mongols' rise introduced something new into the equation. They became a rival that required attention. This is where the deeper meaning of the rivalry appears. It is not simply about violence or territory. It is about recognition. Once two organizations recognize each other as capable opponents, their relationship changes. Every interaction becomes more careful. Every potential confrontation carries additional consequences. Neither side can assume the other will collapse under pressure. The Mongols earned that recognition through survival and persistence. And, in the outlaw biker world, recognition from a rival as powerful as the Hells Angels carries a message that does not need to be spoken. It means the balance of power has become more complicated than it once was.